evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries here in Latonia. I said sunny Latonia last week. It's still sunny because it's still this week for me. For you, of course, it's a week later. And if you're not familiar with these programs, we record two programs back to back and they go on to different weeks. More for the ease of recording them and getting them to the studio, to the CPC that puts them out for us. Than anything else. And besides, we've always done it that way, so why change, right? Okay. We have been talking this last week about the second in our series, Cities of the Bible, and the first program, part one, if you will, of Jericho, which was obviously a well-known city of the Bible. A couple of things I should point out to you that whilst you can watch this on Channel 17 or if you're on Cincinnati Bell on Channel 817, and it occurred to me that if you're watching this, you already know that, but maybe you can spread it around to your friends and neighbours. But also, these programs eventually end up on our church website. Now, they tend to come up there a little while after they've been broadcast on the TV network. And the reason for that, of course, is not to try and preempt them. But if you go to Latonia Baptist Church, latoniabaptist.org/TV, or even if you just go to that, there's a TV key there you can go to, and then you go to whichever program you would like. It comes up with a little, what do they call them? Keyhole shots, of the different programs that you can look at. And there's a wealth of programs on there. We're usually running 2 or 3 weeks behind what we're actually doing on the TV, but if you're, for example, watching this program and you miss the next two, you'll be able to pick them up on our website. So don't forget that. And also, if you've got comments, even things you don't agree with perhaps, and that, believe me, that happens a lot. I try to do as much research as I can for these programs, but sometimes I will say something that perhaps the scholars believe, but not every scholar, and you're one of those people who know that somebody said, no, that's not right. Feel free, by all means, to email me. I promise you this, unless your email is nasty, I will answer it. Okay? I mean, if it's critical, I'll still answer it. I mean, the only way we learn sometimes is having somebody critique what we're doing and make us go back and look. And quite often I get critiques. People say, well, you said this, and I don't believe that's true. And I say, well, here's where I got it from, or here's the quotation or here's the part of the Bible that says that, or what have you. And again, I don't often say this, but it probably needs to be said from time to time. The program's called What the Bible Says Today. And then this is not a Bible teaching program. That's for your pastors and for your Sunday school leaders and that sort of thing. And of course, you yourself in your private moments with your own Bible study. This is a program that looks at what we have from the Bible and why is it that way? Where was that? What happened there? Why do the ancient Israelites do it this way? And how much of that transposed over into the new Christian era and that sort of thing? It's an informative discussion, except you don't get to discuss much because I do all the talking. But, as I said, the email's there, we can discuss. But that's the idea. And if you have an idea for something, if you have something in that's chewing you at the back of your mind, you say, what about this? Why did they do that? By all means, bring it up, because every so often we do a series of programs on loosely called What About or What If, and we answer those questions, all right? So don't forget. So back to Jericho. And I finished up last week with a little bit of a teaser, which is to make you tune in this week, of course. But I said we got to the book of Joshua. Now, if you read the book of Joshua, and I'm sure you did that last week because I asked you to for your homework, right? The Battle of Jericho was the first battle that the Israelites fought in their conquest of Canaan. That's its claim to fame, if you will. They crossed the River Jordan, and the first battle they had, of any consequence, I suppose, was Jericho. Okay? And according to Joshua 6, verses 1 through 27, the walls of Jericho fell after Joshua's Israelite army marched around the city blowing their trumpets. I mean, it's longer than that, but you all know the story. Okay? So, obviously, when we start getting into the age of archaeology, and when people can start, trying to find out what really happened at the time, we do excavations. And now, the biblical Jericho is a lot different place than the current city of Jericho. It's off to one side, if you will. But excavations at the Tel Es Sultan. Now, Tel means hill, mountain, mesa, whatever you want to call it, which was where the biblical Jericho was. Now, excavations at Tel Es Sultan, which have been going on for years and years and years, right, have failed to produce any data to substantiate the biblical story. Now, hold on your hats. Don't start throwing something at the screen or getting on your phone, because we'll be gone by the time you call it. Anyway, but scholars are virtually unanimous. And when I say this, I mean Catholic scholars, Baptist scholars, Presbyterian scholars, Jewish scholars even, are virtually unanimous that the book of Joshua has very little historical value. Now notice that word historical value. Don't forget, the Bible is not a history book. Yes, it has history in there. And yes, we can compare it to things that were happening in the world around it. And we do quite often. But it was written by people who had very little interest in anything else that was happening around them, and everything was about what they did and about what their God encouraged them, forbade them, led them, dissuaded them from. Okay? I mean, I say Joshua is told in chapter 6 of Joshua, which is in the first 5 books of the Bible. In it, it tells how Noah cursed Canaan to become a slave. And I'm not going into details because it would take too long, plus the fact you've already read it. Okay? And how God gave the land of the Canaanites to Abraham and his descendants. Now, the land of the Canaanites basically is the hill country of Israel today, because the Phoenicians lived on the shore. Okay? The children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, themselves became slaves in Egypt. We all know that. But through Moses, God brought them out of Egypt and to the borders of the promised land, Canaan, off the desert. And there Moses instructed them to seize the land by conquest and placed them under the command of Joshua. This is all very familiar stuff, isn't it? Okay? Now Joshua, and I've read a lot about Joshua because we're only surmising what we know of him through the Bible. There's no historical other references to him whatsoever. The first place they came to of any consequence was Jericho. They came out off the desert, over the hills, and there's Jericho, right? So he sends spies to Jericho. Not stupid is Joshua. He sees this place, so he sends spies out. And I'm paraphrasing this, but they discovered that the land was in fear of Israel. I mean, with a certain amount of obviousness about it. I mean, no matter how many Israelites there were, and if you read the Bible, it's a huge number, and if you look at current thoughts on the subject, it perhaps wasn't as many as you would think, but certainly lots of them, coming across the land, heading for Jericho. Obviously, the outlying farmers and the outlying villages and that are going to come running back saying, hey, there's a bunch of people coming, So obviously, the land was in fear of Israel, and of course, if that's the case, then they must be in fear of their God as well. It's inferred and implied. Okay? So, the Israelites are told to march around the city for once every day for 6 days with the priests and the Ark of the Covenant. All right? And it's a great story. It really is. It's a great story about obedience to God and doing God's wishes. So they march around the city. Okay? There's lots of wonderful paintings of this. One's hanging in the Tate Museum, the Tate Gallery in London. But anyway, of marching around. And if you've got one of those illustrated Bibles, I'll bet you there's a picture in there of the Israelites marching around carrying the covenant, right? And on the 7th day, they marched round 7 times, and then the priests blew their ram's horns, the thing, okay? And the Israelites raised a great shout, and the walls of the city fell. Okay? It's a great story. It really is, okay? And following God's law of Herem. Now, this is going to be a bit hard for some of you to take. the Israelites took no slaves and no plunder. In other words, they didn't capture anybody and keep them as slaves, and they didn't take everything that existed. Okay? But what they did do was slaughter everybody. Now, I personally have a problem with that. I believe the God of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, is the same God as the New Testament, the same God I worship. And I have a problem with a merciful God instructing everybody to kill everything. That's my personal view. You may have a different view. So what is this herem? Herem, H-E-R-E-M, or Sherem, C-H-E-R-E-M, which is a Hebrew word. And what it can refer to is this. Same word used in different places. You know, we have the same problem with English or American English, French, Arabic, this sort of thing. Herem, commercial, if you use it in a commercial sense, it means to boycott or withdraw from commercial or social relations as a punishment. In other words, okay, you cheated us, we're not doing business with you anymore. Okay? It can be a censure. You married a Gentile woman, you're banished from the Jewish community. All right? It can mean a priestly gift, an object that's devoted to God. So already we've got 3 different meanings. And when it refers to war or property, it's a belief that any property or person imperiling Jewish religious life be destroyed. So what the Jews did was, what the Israelites did, was, using that law, they slaughtered everybody in Jericho, according to Joshua. Well, first of all, that's a bit impractical, to be honest. But anyway, we'll leave that alone for a minute. It's a terrible law, that particular use of the word. It's terrible. So they slaughtered every man, woman and child in Jericho, sparing only, of course, Rahab the prostitute who'd sheltered the spies and, of course, her family. I said, great story. The avenging Israelites, this sort of thing. But did it happen like that? Probably not. In fact, almost certainly not. And here's the reasons why. Now, before I go into that, let me say that most scholars believe that the Jericho story is one of those things handed down through the centuries, but it's more of a story about obedience to God, doing what God wants. If you do what God wants, then you'll achieve your object, you know. So, and the walls fell outwards. Remember we said that. Okay, well, let's look at some of the history of that and the origins. In 1868, I want to get my facts straight here, a chap called Charles Warren identified the Tel es Sultan, in other words, the mound, as the site of Jericho. And so many cities in Israel were built on mounds, on little mountains, little hills, this sort of thing. They're dotted all over the place. Okay? There's a wonderful story. If you want some fiction story to help you understand this, read The Source by James Michener, which is basically an account of a modern-day archaeological dig at one of these tells. And it goes right down to Stone Age and up from there. And at each age, there's a story about that age. But it's a wonderful... If you want to get something about Jewish history and Jewish attitudes to things, it's a great book. Anyway, I digress. Anyway, he identified, there's Jericho, by pottery and the rest of the stuff, right? In 1936, John Garstang conducted excavations there. Finally got a group of people together, and this is all documented. In fact, there's a book in the library about John Garstang in our local Kenton County Library, which has all this Jericho excavations and everything. And he discovered the remnants of a network of collapsed walls. Not inwards, but just collapsed, knocked down, which he dated to about 1400 BC. Now, that's the generally accepted era of the biblical date of the conquest. In other words, the Israelites moved into Canaan around 1400 BC. Now that's very vague, but it's around that time, okay? There was a lady called Kathleen Kenyon who re-excavated the site between 1952 and 1958. And she demonstrated definitively, I guess carbon dating, the rest of it. I did read the account of it, but I can't remember all the different techniques she used. But she definitely demonstrated the destruction occurred around 1500 BCE. That's 100 years before the Israelites came. Okay, and it's during a very well recorded Egyptian campaign of that period where they record that they demolished Jericho. So we actually got the record of that. Okay, and that Jericho was deserted through the mid-late 13th century. Okay, mid-late 13th century, 1400, you know, like we're in the 21st century now, but our date is 20 something, because, okay, you get that. All right. And Kathleen Kenyon's work was corroborated in 1995 by radiocarbon tests, right, which dated the destruction level to the late 17th or 16th century. So 1500 was a good choice, but even earlier than that. Okay, there was a small unwalled settlement rebuilt in the 15th century, but the Jericho was unoccupied from the late 15th century up until the 10th and the 9th centuries. So if you look at the archaeological evidence, the biblical story of fall of Jericho cannot be founded on genuine historical sources. Okay, it just historically it didn't happen, and almost all scholars agree that the book of Joshua holds little historical value, as I said, and is written by authors far removed from the times it depicts. In other words, way, hundreds of years later, several hundreds of years later. And it was intended, as I said earlier, to illustrate a theological scheme, in other words, a theological argument, if you will, in which Israel and her leaders are judged by their obedience. And their obedience and their laws and teachings, the covenant, if you will, set down in the book of Deuteronomy, rather than as history in the modern sense. And Deuteronomy was written after this, much later than this. So if you like, it was an exercise in theology. Okay? So, the story of, this is my read on it anyway, the story of Jericho and the conquest in general. There's some other things we can talk about as we talk about these other cities, but probably represents the sort of nationalist propaganda, if you will, of the kings of Judah and their claims to the territory of the kingdom of Israel after about 722 BC. And we've done some of that in our studies, but okay. And these chapters were incorporated into an early form of Joshua, which was written, it appears, in the late in the reign of King Josiah, who reigned 640 to what? 659, something like that. And the book was revised and completed after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, so probably during the captivity, and possibly after the return from Babylon. So the combination of archaeological evidence and analysis of the composition history of the books and the theological purposes lies behind all of this discussion with the archaeologists. And most scholars, really, would appear to confirm that the Battle of Jericho seems more propaganda than factual, which doesn't make it wrong and doesn't make it bad, which doesn't make it should not have been in the Bible. It is an object lesson to those people reading the Bible about the Israelite conquest. It's like, well, we didn't do it, but if we were here, we would have done it. You know, it's one of those sort of things, right? Okay, and Jericho was continuously was continuously operated in the late Bronze Age, but it stopped serving as kind of like an urban centre. It wasn't as popular as it had been in the past. Okay, so we're progressing on into the late Bronze Age. I mean, the city was surrounded by extensive walls. Yes, they did build up the walls again, strengthened with rectangular towers, a bit like a castle wall, only much bigger. And it had an extensive cemetery with shaft tombs. I don't know if you've ever come across those. And sometimes I'm hoping that our people get the green screen and blue screen going soon, because a shaft tomb is literally a shaft and then sort of tombs cut into it, all the way down. You don't see that around anymore. But there were vertical shafts, okay, and of course underground burial chambers. So it was a pretty extensive sort of thing by then. And what they found in them was elaborate funeral offerings, which in some of those could reflect the emergence of local kings and things like that. So the country may have been run by different different rulers, okay, different groups of people. So we come into the Iron Age now. Now Tel Es Satan, the Jericho, remains unoccupied from the end of the 15th to the 10th and the 9th centuries BC or BCE. Okay. When the city was rebuilt, and it was, remember Jericho's been rebuilt, what do we say, 20 times? Okay. By the 7th century BC, it had become an extensive town. But this settlement or town was destroyed by the Babylonian conquest of Judah, obviously one of the cities they knocked down, in the late 6th centuries, and it remained unoccupied again. I mean, how many times can you rebuild it? And it remained totally unoccupied through the Persian, through the Hellenistic, through the Greek periods, all right? So let's look at those periods. Jericho went from being an administrative centre of the province of Judah under Persian rule, which that's what it was, administrative centre under Persian rule, to serving, would you believe, as the private estate of Alexander the Great. Remember Alexander the Great, the Persians came through? Between 336 and 323, after his conquest of the region, in the middle of the 2nd century. So its claim to fame in those days was it was Alexander the Great's country home, or country estate or everything. No real records of how much time he spent there. Okay? Now, Jericho was under Hellenistic rule during the rule of the Seleucid Empire. We talked about the Seleucids. That's when the Maccabees fought them in one of our other programs. But anyway, Jericho was under that rule, which is more Greek rule. And the Syrian general, what's his name, Bacchides, something like that. Anyway, he built a number of forts around to strengthen the defences of the area around Jerusalem against the revolt by the Maccabees. Remember that? The Jewish people revolted. And one of these forts, kind of interestingly enough, one of these forts built at the entrance of the Wadi Kelt, which is where, I said, the wadi that runs through Jericho, was later refortified by Herod the Great. So it's continuous, it keeps going, who named it Kypros, after his mother. So then the Maccabees overthrew the Seleucids, and so the court came to be ruled by the Hashmoneans. Now, it's kind of interesting. First of all, let me explain about the Hashmoneans. That's a dynasty descending from the priestly group from the tribe of Levi, following, of course, the success of the Maccabean revolt. Jordan's kings still claim descent from that Hashmonean line. The current king of Jordan is Hashmonean. So that line has followed through for centuries. Okay? And then, of course, it remains that way until, inevitably, here come the Romans and bring their influence over that to claim the Hashmonean throne and take over. Okay? Now, here's interesting, and I did not know this. during the Herodian period, when Herod ruled Jewish, Herod leased Jericho from Cleopatra. And why did she have it? Because Mark Antony gave it to her as a gift. So he gives her Jericho. Hey, you have the city of Jericho. And Herod rents it from her. Kind of an interesting sort of thing. I wonder what he paid, Anyway, after their joint suicide, after Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, of course, if you know your history books, Octavian assumes control of the Roman Empire and grants Herod, who's his toady, right, absolute rule over Jericho. I mean, Herod was into Octavian, for everything, He was his kept man, So Herod keeps on like that, right? And as part of this new Herodian domain. And, remember what I said about Herod the Great? His big thing was building. He built, the temple, he built this, he built that, built everything else. He also built a hippodrome theatre. It's on a place called the Tel Es Samat, to entertain guests. And he also brought in aqueducts to irrigate the areas below the cliffs. Jericho's pretty high up in the mountains. And to reach his winter palaces, which he built at the site of Tulu Abu, which is a place just outside Jericho. And I think we'll probably leave it there because we go on next week to Aristobulus and his murder, and that all happened in Jericho. So we'll leave it there. But Jericho has been the center of a great many of the events in the Bible, even if it's not mentioned in the Bible per se. The things that are recorded happened in Jericho. Okay? So we're going to leave it right now, the beginning of the Herodian period, or well into the Herodian period. Herod now owns Jericho. It's part of the Herodian Empire. Remember, he had most of Judah and his brothers had Galilee and that sort of thing. And we'll see what he does with it, all right? Until then, you can't read about this because it's not in the Bible, but you can read Joshua again and get a feel for it, okay? Until then, good night. God bless.